Well, they have to take it very seriously because when you see organizations like the New York Times come out with a call for Biden to step aside, these are serious charges or matters to consider. But that being said, there's a few dates that are on the calendar that I think we should take into consideration. One, Monday. That's when the Supreme Court comes down with their issue on immunity. Now, it doesn't affect the race directly, but it's a big news day and it may shift some of the focus. And of course, then the following week, there's Donald Trump's
sentencing.
He'll be sentenced. Thank you, Alex.
Sure.
He'll be sentenced. And that is going to be a seismic event. So I would wait just a little bit longer if I was Team Biden before stepping away to see what the polling looks like maybe on the 12th, 13th, 14th. That's not to say that Joe Biden has serious problems right now. But that being said, I'm not sure who comes in and fills his shoes and gets the job done to beat Donald Trump in November.
So, Dawn, Susan brings this up, but I want to go to lead here the Philadelphia Inquirer, which countered the New York Times that she mentioned, and that goes in addition to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution calling for Biden to step aside. The Inquirer publishing its own editorial saying Trump should leave the race. To be clear, also, the New York Times' editorial was mainly focused on the danger Trump poses and said Biden would be its unequivocal pick if the choice is Biden or Trump. But the headline certainly was that Biden needs to drop out. Is there an assumption, Dawn, that Trump being unfit for office, kind of goes without saying now, but it actually needs saying now?
We all know Donald Trump is unfit, and I think that the parallel headline for as bad as Joe Biden's debate performance was, the parallel headline should be that Donald Trump did not let the truth come out of his mouth one time. We saw a man who continues to degrade women, continues to degrade immigrants, and anybody who he doesn't see as a WASP Christian of the MAGA political genre. So I really think that the equal headline has to be that Donald Trump got up there for 90 minutes, and I don't know anything that he said that was true. So if that is a harbinger or an indicator of being unfit, if truthfulness equals fitness, then Donald Trump has not been fit since he got on the political stage. And I think that's extremely important. But what I saw out of Joe Biden's performance, it was disheartening. It was unfortunate. But, we've had bad debate performances in the past. And I think that the ultimate takeaway for me is that it's not Joe Biden's job or Barack Obama or even Kamala Harris's job to save us from what comes from a Trump administration. It's all of our job to get together and support the Democratic nominee, whoever that may be. And I still expect that as of today and in through November, it will be Joe Biden.
Okay. I'm curious your take on all this, David. Has the country become too desensitized to Trump's lies and his incoherence as it's the norm for Trump? It doesn't shock people anymore, and therefore it doesn't prompt as much outrage. Is Joe Biden held to a higher standard than Donald Trump?
I don't think he's held to a higher standard. I think Donald Trump's unfitness for office, his threat to democracy, is baked in. And so the Biden campaign must continue to remind voters about that. But what we saw Thursday night, the newsworthiness was around what the world saw in Joe Biden. What we saw in Donald Trump is what we see in him every day, and it should be condemned, and it reminds us he's unfit. But what we saw in Joe Biden was somebody that left questions for the American people about their president, not the Democratic candidate. They witnessed the American president, our president, struggle for 90 minutes on stage, and they left with questions. And so that's where the Democratic response now, these 72 hours or so, I think has actually made it worse. And I'm glad you played that Fetterman clip because there was something different about how Fetterman handled it. Fetterman put his medical case out in front of Pennsylvania voters. Fetterman discussed his medical condition. Fetterman was open about that. This White House staff is saying, oh, there's nothing wrong. Don't believe your eyes. They're gaslighting us and saying there's not actually a problem. There was a problem Thursday night. Now, maybe there's an answer to it. Maybe there is a question or an answer to his age, or maybe the way they manage the White House, or maybe he presents in different situations. But those are the answers that will solve the heartburn that the American people left Thursday night with. To tell us that we are wrong is arrogant, it's disdainful, it's insulting. I think the White House staff right now is doing permanent damage. Joe Biden lost ground Thursday night. If the White House staff continues this type of spin control, they're going to lose the race in November. They have to change course this week, and I do actually think they're going to realize that.
In your analysis, Susan, of the debate, you paraphrase former President Bill Clinton saying, quote, "It can be better to be strong and wrong than weak and right." Was Biden too focused on data, on prepared answers, on a level of recitation, it felt like, instead of simply delivering the passion that Democrats were looking for? I mean, how much do viewers of a debate like that focus on optics over substance?
Well, television's a medium in which the viewers see the candidates. They don't just listen or read about them. So I think that while he was over-prepared, probably with too much data, and told not to go off, shoot from the hip like he often does, we didn't see Joe Biden as we know him. We saw no sense of humor. We saw no quick responses to things that Donald Trump put out there. But most importantly, what we did see was that jaw-slackened face with that blank stare. That's what anyone who has a parent or a grandparent has seen people get older. That was the concern, full stop. That's what made people say, oh my God, Joe Biden got so old so fast. And that should be another concern of this White House is, can they keep putting him out there, or is this the best he can be? I don't know the answer to that. But either way, they have to confront that and be really honest with themselves, because if he's aging at a more rapid pace than probably people think he is, come September, October, that's going to spell really bad news for the campaign.
Despite all this focus, Dawn, on Biden, there was a viral moment of the debate that came when Donald Trump accused immigrants of taking black jobs. He then repeated it at his rally the next day. And then there was also a viral moment after the debate, Biden greeting patrons at a Waffle House in Atlanta. The Biden campaign is focused on securing support from black voters. Do you have a general sense of their debate takeaways? I know you say all the time, and we agree, it is not a monolithic group. That said, do you have a general sense?
The very general sense is that Donald Trump remains absurdist and not a friend of black people. If you think immigrants are coming in to take quote unquote black jobs, then I would question what Donald Trump believes the role of black people in the workforce to be. He obviously believes that we are somehow agrarian and remain an agricultural people and hard labor, because let's be clear, immigrants are coming in and doing the Lord's work because they're doing jobs that, this is tough, and I'm trying to make sure I say it right in a non-insensitive way, but they're coming in and doing jobs that other folks don't want to do. They're not taking African-American jobs. They're not taking white folks' jobs. That's just not true. And it's, again, something that Donald Trump can just toss out there, and it's a lie. So black folks have spent much of the weekend determining what is a black job. And it's very, very hard to figure out what that is. But it's a nonsensical term thrown out there by a guy who says nonsensical things. And somehow he's the leader of one of the two parties in this country. So there is no shift of African Americans towards Donald Trump. There is no mass exodus. Although we were disappointed in Joe Biden's performance, I'm willing to say right now that he had a bad night. He had an off night because the very next day he brought the fire, and he was the Uncle Joe that we all know in North Carolina, and you can't catch those two. So, to hell with Donald Trump. He says absurdist things, and we can't continue to give weight and responsibility and verbal authority to this nonsense that he gets up and says. He was the news from Thursday night because he continued to lie. And David's right. His lies have become so embedded into the thing of who he is that we don't even pay attention to it anymore. But it still stinks really bad if we open our noses.
Last question to you, David, with Trump saying that he believes Biden will be the nominee and that he's the Democrats' best shot. Does that make Democrats nervous? Should it, if he's pushing for Biden to be his opponent?
Look, I'm not a Democrat. I'm an independent. I think the Democratic Party is the best vessel to stop Donald Trump and to roll back the authoritarian tide that MAGA presents. It's up to Democrats who they believe is the strongest candidate. Is it Joe Biden or another candidate? Frankly, I think we are so hyper-partisan in our politics in the country, it almost doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter who the nominees are because of how partisan we are. My greatest concern coming out of Thursday night, if the White House staff does not fix the narrative around Joe Biden, is this. It's not that people are going to move to Donald Trump, it's that they're not going to show up. Voter depression will be very real. People who never saw themselves voting for Donald Trump now say, I got a question about whether Joe Biden can serve for 4.5 years until January of 2029. And if that voter says, I give up, can't support either one of them, that's trouble for the country because it likely contributes to Donald Trump returning to the White House.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.